Let me tell you about a book that I just read. I actually read it years ago, and I just reread it this week. To be honest with you, for my own personal encouragement, it's an excellent book. The title is Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. The main person behind the book wrote many of the chapters. Each chapter is sort of a standalone chapter, and there's several authors, but the main author that put it all together is John Piper. Now, I know that some of my friends hear John Piper and their eyebrows raised because in my circles, we used to love John Piper until we didn't, if you know what I mean. And I've always said that I thought that was unfortunate. Years ago, in conservative Christian Bible-believing circles, the line that was drawn between the two fraternal teams was Calvinists and Arminians, or not non-Calvinists. And Piper is a Calvinist, so he's on our team, and all the rest. Very influential in my life, by the way, of understanding the doctrines of grace way back in the day, 25 years or so ago. I was binge listening to his sermons and reading a lot of his books and all the rest. But so that was sort of the line, Calvinist and non-Calvinist. And then about 6, 7 years ago, all the teams got mixed up. And then the line that separated was wokeness and critical race theory. And unfortunately, John Piper sort of fell off the fence on the wrong side of things, if you know what I mean. And so a lot of people distanced themselves from Piper. And I thought that was unfortunate because, sure, there's some very cringeworthy things that Piper has said in the last 6, 7 years. And but I think we ought to be able to compartmentalize that and say, here's what's good and here's what's not so good, and take the good, because when Piper is good, he's excellent. If you have not read his main book, Desiring God, classic. And on this topic, suffering and the sovereignty of God, not many are better. And so I think that people kind of threw John Piper under the bus prematurely. And testimony to that, for those who in the know, I don't know if y'all, if you saw MacArthur's funeral service just several weeks ago, Piper spoke. That ought to tell us something. Maybe some people, dismissed him too quickly. MacArthur guys didn't, apparently. And I heard that he might be preaching actually at Shepherd's Conference next year. But anyway, back to the book, Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. Let me tell you about the book. It came out of their 2005, I think it was, Desiring God conference that Piper puts on up there, and they reworked many of the talks and put them into chapters. So each chapter is sort of a standalone chapter on this topic of suffering and the sovereignty of God. They kind of broke it up into 3 sections: suffering and the sovereignty of God, suffering and the purposes of God, and suffering and the grace of God, but all under that umbrella of suffering and the sovereignty of God. The first chapter is Piper's, which is gold. That's worth the book, just that one chapter. And I remember listening to that sermon when he preached it at Desiring God conference way back then, and was blown away. I probably listened to that sermon 4, 5, 6 times. Just because it was so helpful, talking about how God is sovereign, in control of all things, which was very helpful for me after following Hurricane Katrina and all the rest, especially when he dealt with, I can still almost hear his voice when he was explaining the book of Job, and how when Job says, how can we take good from the Lord and not evil? That the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in case, and this is what Piper said, in case you think that maybe Job misspoke, listen to the inspired author of the book that immediately after Job's affirmation says, in this, Job did not sin with his lips or credit God with wrong. So the good, the bad, everything that happens comes from God's sovereign hand. And so we have that rock solid truth, but then we have to ask the question, why? What is he doing? What are the purposes? And that's what the rest of the book deals with. Well, that's what the book deals with, making sure that we understand that God is sovereign, And even in our suffering, or maybe especially in our suffering, we should recognize that God is sovereign. Like I said, Piper wrote several of the chapters. The first chapter, gold. The second chapter was Mark Talbot. And the second chapter is probably, if any of the chapters are a little more academic, this one is a little more academic, even though it's not. Yeah, it is very practical. It's very practical and helpful. And he basically pushes back against the doctrine of open theism that was really gaining ground back 20 years ago. I don't know how well that movement fared. I don't think very well, or else it's just not on my radar anymore. But I'll never forget being at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting, probably about 25 years ago. Society of Biblical Literature is an academic, professors and biblical studies and all. And I was there with my professor, Rick Bajron, Dr. Bajron, who's in heaven now. But we were sitting there and we went and heard Greg Boyd. And Greg Boyd is one of the main proponents of open theism. Open theism basically says that God is the God of the possible, that God knows every potentiality. He doesn't know which decision that you might make today, but he knows all the potential ones and works all things together for good in that way. And it was a mesmerizing talk by Greg Boyd. I remember as a young seminary student, I was working on my PhD, and I was sitting there with Dr. Bajron, and afterwards, a lot of it, to be honest with you, went over my head. And we were eating lunch later, and Dr. Bajron said, "What'd you think about the talk?" I'm like, "Ooh, that was pretty interesting." Bajron said, "That was heresy." I'm like, "Oh," and so he explained it to me, and it was so helpful. But anyway, in this book, in chapter 2, very succinct pushback against this doctrine of open theism, and why it is not helpful, why it's not biblical. Great chapter by Mark Talbot. There's several other chapters. I won't go through every single chapter, but Piper writes several other chapters about the purposes of God in suffering. One of the chapters is David Powlison wrote a chapter. That was a really good chapter. He kind of basically exegeted the hymn, How Firm a Foundation, one of my favorite hymns, and just walked through stanza by stanza and commented on it and applied it to our life and buttressed it with scripture. Very helpful. Probably the least helpful chapter, and this goes back to Piper's wokeness later, is one on racial suffering or something like that. That chapter, skip that chapter. I shouldn't have said that. You can read the chapter and be your own judge on that. And then, of course, Joni Eareckson Tada wrote a chapter. I mean, how can you deal with the topic of suffering without hearing from Joni? I assume Joni Eareckson is quadriplegic. Has ministered for years to the handicapped community and sort of a spokesman for Christ in that arena. Just an excellent book. Joni is just very encouraging to me as a handicapped person. And then not only am I, and if you're watching this, there might be a couple of people who don't know that I'm almost blind. I'm going blind. My whole life I've been going blind. And it just gets worse and worse every year. And then this past week was extremely difficult. I just had shoulder surgery. I don't know if you can tell, I have a sling on, and has not been fun. But compared to Joni, oh my soul, my life is easy. And so she was very encouraging in the book. Then there's another chapter in the book by Steve Saint. If you're not familiar with Steve Saint, he's a missionary. Has some sort of airplane ministry, bringing people into difficult places. But he was the son of Nate Saint, who was killed by a tribe that him and a group of guys were trying to reach for Christ. Famous story. May be familiar with Elizabeth Elliot in that, but Nate Saint was one of those that tried to reach this tribe and got speared to death. And that was Steve Saint's father. Steve Saint was a baby at the time. And they actually went back later and did reach the tribe for Christ. And the guy that, one of the people that murdered his dad got saved. And actually, when Steve Saint was 10 years old, he got baptized by the man who killed his father. That is blows you away. And so anyway, the chapter in this book on suffering the sovereignty of God is suffering the sovereignty of God in missions. Just excellent chapter there. And I could go on and on. There's other chapters. I won't go, like I said, I'm not going to go through every single chapter because I want you to get off of YouTube and go read a book. And a good book that would be, well, I'll put a link in the description to the book on Amazon. You can buy a hard copy, or you can go to the Desiring God website and they will have a free download of the book. Piper gives all his books away for free. It's awesome. And so, let me point you in that direction, and so you can get off of YouTube and go read a book.